Star Wars is an iconic franchise. While other franchises today may be both more commercially successful and have a bigger audience, Star Wars nonetheless occupies a place in our cultural heritage that no other franchise can supplant, even if the brand has seen its share of high-profile misfires in the last few years. Part of what gives Star Wars this iconic stature is that when audiences first saw it in 1977, they walked into something they hadn't experienced in live action before. Namely, a fully realized, lived-in, different world that the audience could immerse and project themselves into. Part of what made that immersion possible was that the world came with a backstory, an implied canon, which sold viewers on the illusion that what they were experiencing, for lack of a better term, was real. The focus on maintaining that illusion by adhering to the ever-evolving canon greatly contributed to bringing in generation after generation of new fans. Today, however, Lucasfilm no longer values canon the way they once did. In this editorial, I will begin by going through how the creative executive in the Lucasfilm Story Group views canon, before exploring the wider conflict between canon and the individual story. Finally, I will give my own take on how this conflict could be resolved, citing a few examples in the process. Matt Martin started out working for Lucasfilm in 2007, first as a buyer and product developer for StarWarsShop.com. But he has since risen in the ranks to creative executive of the Lucasfilm Story Group, the division of Lucasfilm that is responsible for keeping track of Star Wars canon in order to assist writers and directors in the development of new stories. For some time, Martin has made the argument that canon need not be taken that seriously. There are some inconsistencies here and there, and not everyone will like everything, so fans are free to decide for themselves what they consider to be and not to be canon. Two of his tweets from May 9th went viral, which underlined his point. One read, "So to summarize, there is a reason that we need to internally know what is and isn't canon, so we can keep our line of official storytelling as aligned as possible, but that doesn't mean fans can't individually pick and choose what they want to accept as true." The other tweet, and this is the one that many objected to, read, "It's all fake anyway, so you can choose to accept whatever you want as part of the story." To be clear, what he says here isn't wrong, not per se. Star Wars is fiction. No one ever believed otherwise, and like many other brands that have had decades worth of storytelling added to its overall output, your own headcanon is going to play an ever bigger part in which parts of the story that resonate with you and which parts you pay no attention to. Look on the bright side. A representative of the Lucasfilm Story Group just officially sanctioned that everyone who doesn't like Disney's sequel trilogy are free to dismiss it as fanfiction. However, I still feel that putting it that bluntly on a public forum like Twitter perhaps isn't what someone whose job description includes maintaining Star Wars canon should be doing, as it breaks the illusion of what Star Wars should be. I do see his point though, so let's explore that point further. Matt Martin referenced an article first published by IO9 as essentially articulating what he was struggling to do within the restrictions of Twitter. This article, titled "Our Fascination with Canon is Killing the Way We Value Stories," begins by stating, "As the pop culture we love becomes increasingly dominated by vast franchises of interconnected worlds and stories, so does it become dominated by one singular question from die-hard fans. Is the thing we're about to consume canon to everything else we've consumed before? It's an attitude that's turning our love of stories into some bizarre archival competition." The article argues that while there is plenty of room for both variety and interpretation even in the strictest of canons, our hunger for canon goes terribly wrong when whether or not something matters becomes the base standard for how we consider a piece of media. The article continues. It's an attitude that has become predominant, not just within fandom circles itself, but in the media commentary that has developed around these fandoms and the blockbuster franchises that dominate our popular culture. Critics and fans alike are now less interested in actually interpreting a piece of media thematically or to engage with why they liked or disliked it, but instead to pick it apart and break it down to the base components of what are, essentially, its pure, unflinching facts. In other words, IO9 bemoans that both fans and critics spend too much time discussing whether or not something is canon, and if the presence of something makes something else canon, rather than interpreting and enjoying the work itself. They even argue that craving for strict continuity above all else is a toxic attitude that basically begets gatekeeping and other negative stuff, and robs discussion of the content we do get of nuance and interpretation. The article concludes, valuing the sterile facts of these stories more than the things about them that make us think or feel is a sad thing indeed. Matt Martin of Lucasfilm Story Group fame echoes this sentiment, saying in another tweet, "Canon should be an added bonus but not the end-all be-all of a story. The EU is no less good now than it was before due to the fact that it's no longer canon. That didn't change the stories." So, what should we as fans do? The Lucasfilm Story Group and IO9 evidently wants us to stop obsessing over canon and continuity, and instead discuss the intentions and interpretations of each separate work. Are they right in wanting that? As usual, I have a take on this. Before I address the issue of canon within Star Wars, let me bring up some other examples pertaining to other canons. First, consider Avengers Endgame. That movie has been hotly debated, analyzed and discussed by fans, critics and pundits alike. Interestingly, all of that discussion was about the movie itself and the implications of it, not whether or not it was canon or whether or not it canonized something else. Then consider Joker. That movie has also been hotly debated, analyzed and discussed by fans, critics and pundits alike. Like with Avengers Endgame, all of that discussion was about the movie itself and the implications of it, not whether or not it was canon or whether or not it was canonized by something else. In my view, the reason there is little to no discussion about those movies' placement or lack thereof in canon is because it's a complete non-issue. In the case of Avengers Endgame, that movie's integration within the canon of the MCU is so pitch perfect that it's simply a given. There is nothing to discuss there, although there is plenty to discuss about the movie itself and where it left things off. Similarly, in the case of The Joker, the filmmakers were abundantly clear that it was a standalone story that doesn't line up with anything else. So outside of wishful thinking, there was nothing to discuss there either. But there was plenty to discuss about the movie's message, subtext, and where it left things off, which indeed have been fruitful topics for discussion. My point here is that in both of these cases, any issues pertaining to canon were so clear-cut that the matter was simply a non-issue, and therefore nothing to debate. Hence, the discussion was focused on the movies themselves. Of course, there are plenty examples where the canon isn't as clear-cut as those. Consider Logan, which is part of the X-Men franchise. A film franchise that was never able to keep its own canon and continuity straight for more than 2 movies in a row. Even so, Logan was universally praised, and the discussion was mostly about the movie itself and its standalone merits. There was of course more discussion about how it fit into canon than there had been with either Avengers Endgame or Joker, but the movie, like those two, was still a great one, so the canon wasn't the focal point. So, here we have 3 very different movies that represented 3 different levels of adherence to canon, but on all of them, the adherence to canon was but an afterthought in the discussion surrounding them. What lessons can we extract from that? My view on the matter is that in the case of Avengers Endgame and Joker, the question of canon was not in doubt, hence there was no discussion about it. There was more such discussion on Logan, where canon was in doubt. And to bring in some other examples, there was more discussion still when canon was in doubt and quality was something of a mixed bag as well. Which was the case with the Marvel Netflix shows, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and other output from the now defunct Marvel Entertainment, or for that matter, Sony's Venom-centric Spider-Man spin-off universe. And yes, there is more discussion about canon inside the full width of the Star Wars universe, and Lucasfilm brought that upon themselves in a way Marvel never did. Lucasfilm declared the expanded universe as non-canon, and that everything made from there on out would be canon. But then they couldn't keep the new canon made entirely on their watch internally consistent. And that invited extra scrutiny where canon is concerned. They either went too far in declaring the expanded universe non-canon, or they didn't go far enough, allowing too much to still fall within that definition. That's on them, especially after they themselves made active declarations of what is and what is not canon. The biggest problem for Star Wars though, and probably the real cause of the toxicity that IO9 invokes, is that the stories themselves haven't been good enough. If Logan showed us anything, it was that if the product in question is good, fans will find a way to reconcile and forgive any deviances from canon. The surrounding canon is what makes us fall in love with franchises to begin with, but the story is at the heart of the matter. When the quality of the story slips is when fans become extra sensitive to deviances from canon. That is what Lucasfilm should take away from this, and they aren't the only ones. One can argue, as I indeed have, that under the modern iteration of Star Trek, both adherence to canon and quality of storytelling has slipped, causing many a fan to shift their allegiance to the Orville, which, while a parody of Star Trek, retains the quality of storytelling once associated with Star Trek. That actually serves to underline the point both Matt Martin and IO9 are making. Canon is good and all, but the quality of storytelling must come first. Fans will embrace both something with a spotty canon or even outside of canon altogether, as long as it's good. Just look at the Orville, or the Joker, or Logan, or to bring things closer to Star Wars again, Spaceballs. As many of you know, for all my commentary on Star Wars, I'm not really a Star Wars fan. I never grew up with it, so I was exposed to it too late. So while I like it fine, I have no childhood nostalgia attached to Star Wars. What I have childhood nostalgia for, however, is Spaceballs. That I did grow up with. In some weird sense, Spaceballs is my Star Wars. I want to share my love of Spaceballs with you. So on this Friday, Tom and myself will be attending a Spaceballs watch party on Discord. This watch party will be held on Friday, May 15th at 8:30 p.m. Central European Time. That's 7:30 p.m. UK time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You are all invited to watch it with us, so head on down to the description for the link and sign-up instructions to Discord. Also attending, or rather hosting, for it is their watch party, are David Weiner and Andrew Hawkins, respectively the director and associate producer of the upcoming documentary In Search of Tomorrow. You may recall I have spoken of that before. It is the follow-up to the excellent horror documentary In Search of Darkness, and it promises to be the most extensive retrospective on the science fiction cinema of the 80s ever made. In it, some great productions will be covered, both that you already know and that are only waiting for you to discover them. In Search of Tomorrow will also include the participation of some very well-known YouTubers like James Rolfe and Chris Stockman, and if stars align, a Midnight's Edge contribution is not off the table. In Search of Tomorrow is currently fundraising, and it blew past the minimum threshold required to make it in less than 24 hours of its Kickstarter launch, so it is happening. But this is a scalable production, meaning the more resources put into it, the more epic it will be in running time, scale, and scope. So if you want to contribute towards it, the opportunity is still there. Head on over to the description, where you'll also find an affiliate link to In Search of Tomorrow's Kickstarter, so they can see we sent you and you can see which rewards, even on-screen credit, you can get for your contribution should this be something you want to be part of. With that, let me know your views on canon, and your views on the Lucasfilm Story Group view of canon in the comments.